a very big welcome to you from all parts of Judaism education, whether you are a volunteer, an organizer, a professional, an organization involved in education, a synagogue, or any other organization that's taking part in this kind of activity. Whether you're in a city or whether you're in a small community, or whether you're completely independent of all that altogether, you're all come together today. What JSCN is doing with this conference is working nationally with absolutely everybody who's involved. I want to take a few minutes to just tell you about a few things. Jewish Small Communities Network, the background to this conference, and a little bit about what to expect this morning. So JSCN serves 55,000 people in communities and families living independently all across the country, in 100 communities which are spread across 72 towns. Now, back in the 1907 Jewish yearbook, there were 88 towns listed which had Jewish communities. And today there are still 72 towns that have Jewish communities. So really, we're still doing quite well in the small communities. Like I say, today's conference is not just the small communities, but it's national. Everybody, whether you're in London or a small community, wherever you are. Now, how did JSCN get involved in this side of things, in teaching about Judaism? Well, back in 2010, we started to get a trickle of requests, messages being left on our website from teachers. Most of them were a bit vague, and sometimes we didn't know where the schools were that were leaving the messages. So we formulated a system where we would get the right information in, and we started matchmaking those requests with, in the first place, small communities who could provide the talks and the visits that the teachers were requesting. And that just grew and grew and grew. Recently, we took a snapshot and extrapolated from just the small communities how many talks they've been giving over the years. And we worked out that over the last 10 years, small communities alone have been responsible for delivering insights into Judaism and Jewish life to well over 1.2 million pupils in 10 years. That is an amazing number in itself. Pre-COVID, Jewish Small Communities Network was making 80 new connections between communities and schools or educators every year. But from July 21 to this year, July 2022, that number had gone up to 175, well over double. And we're just at the point where we're having to rethink about our system for making those matches, because it's a struggle to do that. I've had the privilege to see Judaism talks in action in a number of different communities and places over the country, as well as doing some of them myself in person. And after the conference, we're going to invite you to share some of the resources that you created locally, because I've been seeing those as well, whether it's books, whether it's films, whether it's teacher packs. There's a whole load of things. And it's seeing all those people delivering Judaism talks or tours of synagogues, which has really given me the idea, well, if that person's doing it there and somebody else is doing the same thing over there, but slightly differently, well, maybe you'd like to compare notes. And that's the whole thing about today. It's sharing, talking about what you're doing, meeting one another, because you've been all doing it really splendidly, but never meeting one another and sharing ideas. I've already thanked the team that's really come behind me to put this together today. So I just want to say thank you to the team once again. In meeting many of you over the years, and I can see a lot of familiar names in the list here today, it seems that what was needed was this chance to meet, and this is what we're doing today. The next step, what happens after this conference, is kind of up to you. We're going to facilitate it, but we really would love it if you would be involved and to keep this going. And maybe we can have another conference next year, perhaps online, perhaps in person, perhaps hybrid, who knows? But I think there might be the appetite for it. So you know that we have a keynote, and we're going to have a panel discussion at towards the end of our conference this morning. And Clive Lawton has very graciously agreed to be a part of that. Clive's reputation goes before him, very much so. When I introduced myself to Clive, I hadn't met him before. We were both at a conference, and I told him who I was. He said, "Oh, you're the guy I keep tripping over every time I Google something to do about Judaism." So we kind of met, but not met before. Clive is going to give our keynote. And let me tell you a little bit about Clive, if you didn't know already. Clive Lawton was awarded an OBE for services to education and the Jewish community in 2016. He's been a head teacher and deputy director of Liverpool's local education authority. He served as the Board of Deputies Director of Education, where he developed the first incarnation of the Jewish Way of Life exhibition, and also more recently wrote GCSE Judaism, the Definitive Resource. He initiated a whole field of school-age Holocaust education, and he was also vice chair of the Anne Frank Education Trust. He was also a chief examiner for A-level religious studies, setting papers on Judaism. And just to top it all, he founded the London School of Jewish Studies degree in Jewish education. So I'd very much like to invite Clive to come now and be spotlighted and give us his keynote this morning. Welcome, Clive.
Thank you, Ed, and hello, everybody. Looking at all your faces, there are lots of folk I recognise. A tremendous turnout from Oxford people, I can see. And I'm contemplating what constitutes a small community. Of course, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this philosophical conundrum, but I certainly saw somebody from Manchester, which I don't think constitutes a small community. I grew up in Ealing, which is out in the west of London, which I'm sure is a small community. And I now live in Bristol, which I think also constitutes a small community. In between that, I was at university in York, which is, I think, as well, a small community. So I have great enthusiasm for small communities, and I believe that we, if I may say we, are best at utilising the maximum amount of talent we have available in our town. You live in Manchester, you live in London, a lot of people just kind of hang around the edges. Well, you can't afford that in a small community, can you? You go after people and grab everybody you've got. And the kind of work that you guys are doing, and of course that's true as well in the big communities in the centres of London and in Manchester or Glasgow or wherever, people are also doing the kinds of work that we're discussing. So it's grand to see some of those folk on this conference as well. We are trying to introduce young people, sometimes older people, to the Jews. Now, I've got about 20 minutes. I am not going to be able to cover the whole field, but I'll come back to that later on. Suffice it to say at the outset, though, that the word Judaism, under which we are generally invited to speak, it's a very uncomfortable word. It's not really a Jewish word. That ism ending tells you straight away we're not in Hebrew territory, we're in Greek territory, which tells you immediately we're not in a Jewish frame. Now, Judaism, what is this Judaism? Furthermore, the other heading under which we're usually called upon to meet our young people is religion, so religious education or something like that. Well, you know, I don't know how many of us feel we are religious. But, you know, I mean, and there may be non-Jews on this call as well, who are our very good friends in doing the work that we do. But for those of us who are Jews, we might be a bit uncertain about how we locate ourselves in Judaism and whether we call ourselves religious. But these are the terms under which many of us, most of us, will be invited to speak to young people. So the first question, the first challenge that we have is, do we accept the terms which are given to us? Please, we've got a group of young people coming to you in a synagogue, which they all think is just a kind of Jewish church. So you're going to come to this place of worship, and you are going to explain to them Judaism, the religion. Now, do we accept that as the offer and say, right, that's what I've got to do then? I've got an hour or half an hour or whatever it is, and I'm going to do the Judaism that is a religion thing in a place of worship? Or do I actually take the opportunity to try and break this down or make it more subtle or expose to people a bigger sense of what we're talking about when we talk about the Jews? My own preference, I hope it's going to be obvious as I go on, my own preference is, of course, to talk about the Jews and not just Judaism. Now, I've been doing this game for a very long time. As Ed indicated, I was Director of Education at the Board of Deputies back in the 1970s, and I was producing booklets and leaflets and a thing called Visiting a Synagogue, I remember, to give to synagogues to hand out to people, and all that kind of thing. I had a film strip, do you remember those? A film strip on Brit Milá. We didn't actually have a close-up of the operation, but nevertheless, you know, we did all that kind of stuff. And I even produced a thing called the Jewish Year Game, which allowed you to play around the Jewish year, and you missed a go if you landed on Shabbat, but you got another 5 points and that kind of thing. So I'm doing all that stuff to try and get young people to understand what the Jews were about. But I was immediately uncomfortable about the business, which all of us are in, more or less, and it's very hard to resist. Standing in front of a group of people, you've got a short amount of time, and you start into this whole thing about Jews believe, Jews think, Jews do, Jews don't, you know, so on and so forth. The other thing that used to happen, I don't think it happens so much, is you turn up to a school to give a talk, and in those days they used to have a thing called resources boxes, and they'd have a Judaism box, and they'd give it to you and go, can you explain this lot? Right, and it'd be like a magician. You'd be whipping out of the box, you know, we wrap this around our heads and we wave this in the air, we stick this up our noses and we, you know, whatever. And you could see the children's eyes getting larger and larger as they saw this bizarre individual living some extraplanetary life just somewhere, you know, near to where they were. And so I took to taking a saucepan in. And I would produce the saucepan out of the box and say, and we cook our food in this. And eventually you'd see a little bit of puzzlement going on. And I'd say, yeah, quite. I mean, we do cook our food in saucepans like people do, because that's the life we live. But this happens to be a meat saucepan, let me tell you. I've also got a milk saucepan, right? So the question is, how much do we seek to, as it were, mystify our audiences? And how much do we seek to make what we are talking about ordinary or relatable? So this is a challenge that all of you are going to face. And I'm not going to try and solve that problem for you, but I want to name the problem, right? To what degree do you try to make the Jews sound like everybody else? And to what degree do you try to make the Jews sound unlike everybody else? Now, if people come away from your visit thinking Jews are just like everybody else, I think you've shortchanged them. But if they come away from your visit thinking, you know, Jews are utterly different, I think you've misled them. So that's the first dilemma I want to know. The second dilemma is, how much time do we devote to accentuating how very different all Jews are? Right. So the old days are just out now. I mean, if you're trying to help anybody with their religious education at schools, you can no longer stand up and say, even if you think it ought to be the case, Jews don't eat pork. You can't do it, right? Because no doubt sitting in the audience anyway is a Jew that does eat pork. And even if there isn't, somebody's got a cousin who's married to a Jew who does eat pork, whatever it might be, right? You can no longer say Jews don't, Jews do, Jews believe, Jews think, because you do have to allow for the variety of Jews that there are. But how much time do you spend doing that, saying that, right? Do you stand up and say, Jews, some Jews eat everything that anybody else might eat? Is that a useful statement? I mean, how far does it help you in your limited time? So you need to find a way to explain the diversity of the Jews. I remember getting, when I was at the Board of Deputies, a message. It wasn't an email, they didn't exist. I think it must have been a letter from Derbyshire County Council. In those days, I think they had identified 6 Jewish teachers in Derbyshire County Council, and they all wanted time off for the festivals. One said it was imperative that they had a day off. Another said it was imperative that they had 2 days off. Another said 3 days off. Another said 6 days off. And Derbyshire County Council wanted to know from me, as the font of all Jewish knowledge at the Board of Deputies representing the Jews, who was right. And I responded saying they're all right. These are all sincere Jews who are seeking important ways to observe their Jewish commitments. But this is a very tricky message, not least to get across to a lot of children. So I think the first clue I'm going to offer you is to ask the children whether there is any generalization that I can fairly make about them. Can I say that all children at Whatnot Primary School are 5'3" tall? Or can I say that all children at Whatnot Primary School love to eat cornflakes for breakfast, or whatever? But is it true that children at Whatnot Primary School have some collective identity which is different to children at some other school? You have to start them thinking about the business of diversity. A key thing to say, I think, is that Jews are specialists in diversity, right? But just by being Jews. That all through history, Jews have always walked to a slightly different tune to the people amongst whom they live. That's sometimes related to food, it's sometimes related to calendar, sometimes related to beliefs, sometimes it's related to other people keeping them out, preventing them from taking part in the world in which they live. But that idea that Jews recognize that the world is made up of lots of different kinds of people, and there are aspects of how Jews have lived through history. That means to say that Jews are always aware that there are diverse people, and that Jews don't want to make anybody else Jewish, but that they want all the rights that they can have to be as Jewish as they choose to be. I think that's a very important message to get across. So in this context, it's really important and tricky to be honest. Some child sooner or later will say to you, so then do you eat pork? I mean, I'm picking on pork as one example, because that's the thing everybody thinks they know. By the way, if you're dealing with secondary school children, you might like to point out, and they're getting towards GCS or something like that, you might like to point out to them that there are no food laws in the 10 Commandments. So a lot of people like to believe that the Jews are all about the 10 Commandments, so that's what they think they know about the Torah. But there are no food laws in the 10 Commandments. So if you're going to try and understand the Jews and Jewish religion, you need to go beyond the 10 Commandments, certainly. But anyway, so if a child says to you, do you eat pork? You might have a sense, especially because the rabbi has asked you to go and give this talk, you might have a sense you're going to let the side down if you say, well, yeah, actually, I just had bacon and eggs for breakfast this morning. But if you don't do that, if you say, oh, well, it's not right, Jews don't do that, or something, I think you're being dishonest to the children that you meet. And I think if it is true that you did have bacon and eggs for breakfast, then I think you must say so. But at the same time, you have to be very careful not to express your, sometimes it gets as high as contempt, doesn't it, for those with whom you don't agree. So here am I, a Shabbat observing Jew, I wear a kippah, whatever it might be, I wouldn't dream of driving to shul, and they say, we're near to a thing called the Reform Synagogue. Is that a proper synagogue? And I go, no, they don't do it properly, right? I'm not allowed, I think, in this context, to express sort of contempt or rejection of diverse Jewish expressions, whatever I personally might think. right? I at least have to be able to say and find the right words to say. Well, that's not my kind of synagogue, and they do things differently to the way that I do them. Better still. But as I understand it, they take seriously this or that view. That's not exactly how I would do it, whatever it might be. If somebody says, well, my uncle's a Jew, but he doesn't do any of this. So again, without a judgment, you need to be able to say, well, that's frequently what we call a secular Jew. It doesn't mean he's not a Jew, because of course he was, I guess if you say he was a Jew, he's probably born a Jew, and that makes him a Jew. But maybe he's not doing any of these things that I talk about. We need to find constructive, positive ways to talk about Jews with whom we don't agree. You're going to get questions perhaps about Haredim. You may not be in your own town or place very familiar with Haredim. So they really are from apparently another planet. You need to find a way to explain constructively, non-judgmentally, where Haredim are coming from, what they think. And if you don't know, you absolutely need to learn to say, I don't know, not make up an answer. Better still, of course, I'll find out. Or I'll ask somebody to send a note to your teacher because this is not my field of expertise. And then look around for somebody who can drop a note to explain those things. So honesty, critically important. Representing others as much as representing yourself. It's not your job merely to talk about you, although of course really important is to talk about you, right? What does it mean to you to be a Jew? Don't try and be the official Jew. Tell them why being Jewish matters to you. Tell them about your bar mitzvah if you had one, or your bat mitzvah if you had one. Tell them why you didn't have a bat mitzvah or a bar mitzvah. Tell them about what you do at Pesach. If you do anything at all, then tell them why you don't do anything at Pesach. And what other people that you know do at Pesach instead. Tell them about the life you live, not some theoretical cipher of the Jewish people. But while doing all of this, take the opportunity to stress that being a Jew is not just about adhering to a set of religious or theological principles. Explain to them that if you say there are 50 Jews in your town or 500 Jews in your town, you're not making a statement that there are 50 people or 500 people who believe in the one God and get up each morning and say the Shema or whatever. That there are Jews with whom you vehemently disagree, and other Jews that are quite like you, and some Jews you don't understand at all. That there are Jews in your town, perhaps, that come from Afghanistan, and there are Jews in your town, perhaps, that are black. That there are Jews in your town who are Ashkenazi or Sephardi. There are Jews that come from all over the world, although, of course, it still remains true in Britain that the vast majority of Jews can trace themselves into Central and Eastern Europe in the 19th century or so. You need to give a picture of Jewish peoplehood. Now, it's a matter of choice for you as to whether you decide to go into tiger country when you've got children with you. You've got a limited amount of time. And I keep saying children, but of course you may well be invited to speak to some adult group as well. You shouldn't assume that the adults are any more sophisticated in their knowledge or understanding than children are. The one thing you might still be able to make an assumption about is that if you're talking to adults, they may have a slightly more Christianized background than the children that you meet. Now, I think that's already changing. And notice I say Christianized, not Christian. You certainly should not assume that just because you've got a bunch of white adults in front of you, they're all Christians. Indeed, if you've got a bunch of black adults in front of you, you might more easily assume that they're all Christians. But you shouldn't make any assumptions anyway about their own religious position or indeed their lack of it. It's not unreasonable, I think, to say to a group, are there any Christians here? Are there any Muslims here? Are there any Hindus here? After all, we are talking about diversity. It ought not to be something to be ashamed of, and it might be quite useful to see if there's any diversity in the group. And don't forget to ask, are there any Jews here? because there may be some one or two that you don't know or don't recognize who are there. And they will love, they might cringe initially, but they will love the formal recognition of who they are, which may not have happened very much in their own circle until that time. So there you are with this group. And I think it used to be the case that many of us assumed that we could reference, for example, the Bible or Christmas or church or something to give them some comparator hook on which to hang our comment. We might say, well, of course, you all know the Ten Commandments, but, well, they don't all know the Ten Commandments. You might say, well, Shabbat is like Christmas every week, right? But for a lot of those people, Christmas might not be a reference point. You might say, a synagogue isn't exactly like a Jewish church, but, church may not mean anything particular to the people sitting in front of you. So don't make any assumptions about these things. By the way, it's becoming increasingly clear that if we are going to look for a comparator religion, we're a bit like something else, you'd probably do better to compare to Muslims than compare to Christians. But their attitude to text, their mosque service, the sort of democracy of the community feels very much more like the way Jews do it than Christians do. It's only historically the fact that we happen to be in a Christian world. But you might decide to go in the tricky areas. Are you going to mention your commitment to, or your enthusiasm for, if you have it, Israel? Or are you going to stay well away from Israel? If you stay well away from Israel, you might have misrepresented the Jews in a general way. I'm not talking about you personally, but again, in your community, it might be true that Israel is an important facet of people's Jewish identity and association and commitment. If you don't mention it, have you allowed the story to run that Jews generally don't care about Israel? If you personally feel very resistant to Israel or conflicted about it, is it a territory you ought to get into or not? Remember this, just because you don't talk about something doesn't mean to say that it's not in the room. Okay, so you always have to decide whether you're going to raise a topic and if you can address it effectively, or whether you're going to leave a topic alone and it can all go horribly wrong in people's minds and you've never talked about it at all. So there are tricky topics. Israel is the obvious one. Holocaust to a lesser extent, but for some people they've heard, is it true that there wasn't 6 million people killed or whatever, right? Do you want to address these things? Do you want to talk about it? How much time do you want to talk about the Jews as a group of people with problems, as it were, or a group of people with joy and celebration? I think critically, what ought to happen at the end of your session is that people go away knowing that there's lots you didn't tell them, that you didn't finish the topic, that you haven't covered this field, you didn't tell them anything about that, you didn't have time to address the other, that there's more to learn. I think that's really important. Even better if they still have questions that they have to find out the answers to, or you've undertaken to find out the answers for them. If you can give a bit of a lift to your session, better still. If you're a singer, sing them a song. If you can tell a joke, tell a joke. But if you can't tell a joke, don't try, right? Because that's just naff and nobody will enjoy it. So I think they should enjoy meeting you. They should be intrigued by stuff. They should feel that Jews are in some way distinctive from non-Jews, but they should also feel that we're not utterly alien. You should give them some sense that being Jewish is more than just a piece of theological commitment or indeed ritual activity. But I'm going to stop there. We haven't had time for questions. I did notice a hand go up, but I think we're going to have a bit more time to pick those things up in the panel and in the small groups. So forgive me, I'm not resisting or avoiding your questions, but we will have a chance to talk later. Back to you, Ed.
Thanks so much, Clive. And you talked about sort of the questions that are going to follow on from whatever anybody says. And we're going to have, I know that today is pretty much opening the Pandora's box on a lot of questions about what we do in our own practices, and how we can do that better, and how we can do that maybe in an expanded way. It's going to be fascinating. So today's conference is really just a tiny snapshot of what's going on. And I anticipate there's going to be a lot more happening when we close down the Zoom and we carry on talking afterwards. So thank you very much to Clive for just giving us just a taste of all the fantastically important work that you're doing and how you're doing it. The importance of what you do is immeasurable. It's not a small thing. It's not just what you do in your synagogue or in your organization. It really does have repercussions all over the place, and you're doing it really well. I visited Northampton, and I know Mike is in the audience today, and I received a copy of their resource pack, which they got funded, and it's a fantastic pack. And I know that many of you, I've seen other ones around the country, and people, as I said, have been doing films as well. But some people have gone that one step further. And two communities which have done that are Leicester and Norwich. And now we're going to hear about two projects which are over £1 million each, done in small communities. And the first one I want to go to, I was very lucky in visiting this one just a few weeks ago, Leicester Hebrew Congregation. And Sam Bosley is the centre manager there.